The bells did not call to worship that Easter morning. They groaned like iron struck underwater, heavy and wrong, echoing not from the steeple, but from the very marrow of the fields. The air was thick with the scent of pine smoke and damp earth, and yet every breath carried a weight, as though the lungs themselves resisted the dawn. The enslaved stirred in their cabins at the sound, but none dared step outside, for they knew what those bells meant. Though none had ever been rung here before, not like this. The overseer's dogs began to howl before the sun rose, their cries twisting up into something that was not quite animal, not quite human. They clawed at the dirt until their nails tore bloody, and still they howled. Some swore they were answering the bells. As if each toll was a command from the high house, the mistress looked out through lace curtains, her hands folded as though in prayer, lips moving. Whispering psalms that no longer comforted, she muttered the name of Christ, but her voice shook, as though the name itself resisted her tongue. She turned from the window sharply, as though someone had looked back from the fields. The bells rang on, though no hand pulled the rope, no steeple bore their weight. The enslaved whispered among themselves, but softly, softer than the rustle of pine needles. "They are not church bells," one old man rasped, his eye milky with cataract. "They are judgment," a woman said, voice cracking, and none disagreed. The earth beneath the cotton rows seemed restless, trembling faintly as the sound rolled across it, a vibration deep in the soil, the kind that makes roots shiver and worms twist awake. The fields that had swallowed sweat and blood for years now stirred. As though answering a summons, children cried in the cabins, clutching at their mothers' skirts, not because of the sound alone, but because of the shape that moved with it, a shape seen only when the bell faded, a dark shimmer at the edge of vision, there and gone again, always walking, always watching, pacing the rows as though counting. "Something's walking with it," one man dared whisper. Another hushed him at once, but all eyes flicked toward the windows, toward the wavering line of dawn that had not yet broken. In the distance, the river carried the sound onward, bending it, making the bells sound as though they rang from both earth and sky, a circle of resonance that held the plantation within it, like a trap. There was no escape, not by horse, not by foot, not even in dream. The mistress, restless, struck the table with her palm and shouted at the servants, "Prepare the meal, it is the Lord's day, and we shall eat in his glory." But her voice cracked, splintered. She poured wine into her cup before the hour was fit. Her hand trembled so badly the red spilled, staining the white cloth in a spreading wound above her head. Crucifixes hung on the wall, polished and gleaming, but one by one they tilted, not by touch, not by tremor, but by some unseen weight. Leaning to one side as though in grief, the bells would not cease. They rolled into the marrow of morning, toll after toll, and with each toll came a hush from the woods. First the sparrows fell silent, then the crows, then the cicadas, until not even the whisper of leaves remained. Only the bells, the bells, the bells. The enslaved gathered at the edge of their quarters, staring toward the high house as if waiting for some sign, their faces pale in the half-light, eyes hollowed with sleepless terror. One child pointed toward the field, her tiny hand shaking. "Look, it walks, it walks." But the elders dragged her back, covering her eyes before she could name what she saw. The shadow moved with the bells, and with every toll it drew closer to the house. By the time the sun finally breached the horizon, the bells stopped, cut off mid-strike, leaving a silence more dreadful than the sound itself. And in that silence came a sigh, long, low, as though the earth exhaled after centuries of holding its breath. The mistress clasped her hands tighter, but her knuckles split and bled against her own nails. She whispered. It begins, though no one had asked her to speak, and none knew to whom she had addressed her words, and in the stillness that followed, a door at the high house swung open on its own, creaking wide into the Easter dawn, as if inviting the shadow inside. Her prayers rose with the dawn, yet each word fell back to earth like stones, lifeless and heavy, choking the air with false holiness. She stood at the window of the high house, lips moving in rhythm to an old psalm, but her hands bore the memory of leather, the sting of rope, the weight of an iron handle. Her palms blistered not from labor but from cruelty, and still she clasped them together, as though God himself might forgive what her tongue concealed. The fields stretched silent before her. Rows of cotton hunched like penitents, but their silence was not obedience. It was the silence of watching, of remembering, of waiting. The soil knew the taste of blood and did not forget. It held within its damp furrows every lash that had opened skin, every scream that had risen like incense, every prayer cut short before it left the mouth. The mistress was a woman of brittle devotion. She sang louder on days she punished harder, her hymns soaring above the cries as if to drown them, as if to smother the sound of sin beneath a cloak of sanctity. Her voice cracked often, not from grief, but from rage that the world itself would not bend faster to her will. "Spare the rod, spoil the child," she muttered. "Obey your masters in all things," she chanted. Her Bible was smudged with fingerprints darkened not by candle soot, but by the faint stain of blood rubbed into the paper where her hand had rested after punishment. Her voice carried out over the veranda, floating thinly toward the cabins where the enslaved huddled, their faces turned down, their ears pricked not for comfort, but for warning. When she prayed aloud, it meant the whip would follow. And when she sang, someone would bleed before sunset. The overseer said she was a woman of iron, a vessel of God's justice, yet even he trembled when she grew quiet. When the psalm ceased mid-verse, for silence was her truest cruelty. The silence before the whip cracked, the silence before she ordered the children forward, the silence that stretched like a blade across the air. And yet the fields did not forget. They stored her cruelty like a buried seed, pressing it down beneath roots, letting it grow in darkness. The trees along the edges leaned closer each year, whispering among themselves, bark splitting in strange patterns like scar tissue, leaves turning black at the edges, not from season but from grief. One of the old women whispered that the mistress prayed not to God, but to herself, that every hymn was an offering to her own cruelty. "She believes in nothing but her own whip," the old woman hissed. But she said it too loudly, and the next morning her back bore 27 stripes, each one carved while the mistress hummed a psalm. It was not the lash alone that burned, but the humming, the way the melody curved over her agony, turning the pain into a hymn, her voice into a choir against its will by Easter. The mistress grew restless, pacing her chambers at night, muttering verses until her voice broke. She stared at the crucifix nailed above her bed, whispering, "Why have you forsaken me?" But the figure on the cross did not answer. The eyes of Christ seemed carved not in sorrow, but in mockery, and she covered it with a cloth rather than face its silence. On the morning of Easter Eve, she struck the house servants before they had even erred, her hand quick with the rod, her mouth quick with a psalm. "The Lord chastens those he loves," she snarled, and the sound of her voice echoed across the parlor, bouncing from wall to wall like a hymn sung by shadows. The children of the quarters lay awake that night, listening to her voice float through the windows, her hymn shifting between prayer and curse, a song without melody, a scripture without meaning. And though no one dared speak, all thought the same thing, and that no God listened to her. Only something darker, something that answered in silence, something that would soon demand its due. And when dawn came, the bells began to toll and the mistress's psalms faltered on her tongue, her voice catching in her throat like a body dangling from a rope. Her hands trembled, the whip slipping from her grasp, and she looked toward the fields as though seeing for the first time that the silence was not empty, it was waiting. Patient, ancient, heavy with memory, and in that silence the soil seemed to move, as if something beneath had turned over in its sleep. Awakening to the sound of bells, the mistress fell to her knees, pressing her blood-marked hands against her chest, whispering half a hymn, half a plea. "Lord, let them not rise," she begged, but the fields had already risen in silence, and the bells had already begun to summon what she feared most. And in that moment, with her face pressed to the floorboards, she realized that every psalm she had sung had been a seed planted in blood, and now on Easter the harvest would come. Her silence was not emptiness. It was a blade, honed on years of cruelty, sharpened on prayers left unanswered, polished on grief too deep for tears. She moved like smoke through the quarters, a figure always half seen, half whispered, her hands rough with labor yet steady as stone, her lips closed as though she held a secret between her teeth. And perhaps she did, for silence can be a sharper weapon than any axe. The others feared to look too long at her, for in her gaze was no resignation, no brokenness, only fire, a flame banked but not extinguished, a light that had no place in this land of whips and chains, a fire that burned not to warm but to consume. They called her Naomi beneath their breath, a name said softly in the night when the lamps guttered and the mistress's hymn still clung to the rafters. They said it with reverence, they said it with fear, for they knew something lived inside her silence, something waiting, something the fields themselves seemed to lean toward. Children crept to her side, drawn not by words but by the steadiness of her presence. She braided their hair in silence. She held their trembling hands when the lash struck their mothers. She whispered only once, "Hush," and the word carried more weight than any sermon, as though the earth itself obeyed. The old ones said her silence was a curse, that the ancestors had closed her mouth to preserve her power. "Do not force her to speak," one warned, "for if she opens her mouth, the world may not bear it." But others said her silence was prayer, the kind not uttered but lived, the kind that coils in the heart until it bursts, the kind that moves unseen yet shakes heaven and earth alike. The mistress hated her most of all, for silence cannot be bent, silence cannot be broken. Silence is rebellion in its purest form. And when Naomi met her gaze across the yard, whip raised in the mistress's hand, the lash faltered, the strike lost its strength, and the mistress turned away, muttering a psalm too quickly, as though chased at night. When the bells began their hollow toll, Naomi's eyes caught the firelight in a way that made them burn red, though no flame touched her face, and the others swore they saw shapes in her pupils, reflections of what had not yet happened, images of doors swinging open, of blood spilled on white cloth, of shadows walking the fields. One of the men dared whisper, "She sees it before it comes," and though the others hushed him, none disagreed. When the dogs howled, Naomi did not tremble. She merely turned her head slowly toward the sound, as if listening for a language beyond human ears, as if translating cries of beasts into prophecy. Her silence filled the quarters like smoke, seeping into dreams, heavy, suffocating, yet strangely consoling. For though the others feared her, they also leaned closer to her when night fell, as though her very presence built a wall against the mistress's psalms one night. A child asked, in the hush between tolls of the phantom bells, "Will it end?" Naomi did not speak, but her hand closed around the child's wrist, and in her grip was an answer stronger than words, a promise both tender and terrifying, a promise of endings on Easter morning. As the bells shook the dawn, Naomi stood apart from the others, eyes fixed on the high house, lips pressed so tightly together that blood welled from the corners of her mouth, and still she did not open them. Her silence rang louder than the bells. Her silence was the toll of judgment itself, and when the mistress stepped out onto the veranda, psalms spilling from her mouth like spoiled wine, Naomi's gaze rose to meet hers, and in that instant the hymn faltered, words stuttering into nothing. The whip slipped from the mistress's hand, her knees buckling as though struck by an unseen blow. Naomi did not move. She did not speak, but in her silent eyes the fire grew, and those who watched swore they saw an axe gleam there. Though no iron had yet been lifted, the silence thickened. It pressed on the lungs, it filled the cabins, the fields, the trees, until the very air seemed to choke. And then, just as the bells ceased, cut mid-strike, Naomi blinked once slowly, and all knew that something had been decided, something that could not be undone. It waited in the dark, where grain dust hung heavy as breath, where light dared not linger, just wood and iron, yet more than either, a shape that seemed to watch though it had no eyes. The axe leaned against the beam, its blade dulled by years of splitting wood, its haft scarred by hands long buried, and yet it carried a weight that no tool should carry, a stillness too deliberate, as though the air itself bent around it, holding its silence like a secret. The old men whispered that tools remember, that iron drinks what it cuts, that wood soaks what drips across it, and that the axe had been fed before, not only by oak and pine, but by something warmer, something redder, something that cries when parted. "They do not forget," one grey-haired man muttered in the hush of the quarters. "Iron keeps the sound," another added, and the others shivered, for they knew the granary was colder than the night. Though no frost ever touched its walls, Naomi had passed it often, carrying baskets, carrying burdens, carrying silence, and each time her eyes flickered once toward the shadows where the axe leaned, as though measuring it, as though weighing its thirst against her own. The children dared one another to touch it, to creep inside the granary at dusk and lay a finger on the haft. But none lasted more than a heartbeat, for the air there grew thick, choking, and the grain whispered when no wind stirred. A dry rustle that formed no words, yet carried the cadence of prayer, a prayer too low, too broken to comfort. Some swore the blade gleamed, though no lantern lit it, a faint shimmer, like breath on glass, as if the iron remembered the warmth of what it had once bitten. as if it yearned for more. The mistress had ordered it left there, for firewood and branches, but she never entered the granary herself, muttering that the dust ruined her lungs, though others said it was not the dust she feared, but the silence. A silence thicker than even Naomi's, a silence that pressed against the skin until it burned. One Easter Eve, as the bells tolled without rope, Naomi stepped into the granary alone, her shadow stretching long against the stacked grain sacks, the sound of her feet muffled by dust, her breath steady as stone. She did not reach for the axe at once. She stood before it, studying it as one studies an altar, as one waits for permission to speak before a throne. The grain rustled, the beams creaked, the air shifted heavy, and still she said nothing. Her silence was enough. Her silence was an answer, and in that silence the axe seemed to stir, not moving but shimmering faintly, as though waking from a long sleep. Behind her, unseen, the door creaked wider, as though the granary itself leaned closer to witness. She lifted her hand, slow as dusk, her fingers grazing the haft, and the wood was not cold as she expected, but warm faintly, like flesh that has only just ceased breathing. She closed her hand and the grain hissed, 1,000 dry voices, a sound like wind through bone. Her grip did not falter. Her eyes burned steady. She lifted the axe, the weight settling into her shoulder, as though it had waited only for her, as though it had been carved for her alone. Iron and wood sighing against her palm in recognition. Thirst, a child later swore she heard whispered from the granary, though no mouth had spoken. Thirst echoed again, as if the axe itself had memory enough to speak. And when Naomi carried it back into the night, the bells tolled louder, shaking the air, shaking the very beams of the house. And those who saw her pass said her shadow was no longer hers alone. It carried another shape, taller, broader, the shape of something that had swung the axe long ago and was swinging it again through her. The mistress at her window pressed her nails into the sill until blood welled, watching Naomi walk across the yard with the axe, whispering frantic psalms that failed her lips, whispering the name of God that sounded hollow in her throat. The axe gleamed in the firelight of dawn, and the field stirred as though leaning closer, as though waiting for the first blow. And in the silence that followed, Naomi raised her eyes once more, and all who met them swore they saw the blade already dripping, though no strike had yet fallen. The table gleamed in the low candlelight, its surface polished to a shine that reflected faces distorted in the waxen glow. Yet the shine could not soften the weight in the air. For it was not the table of Christ's feast, but of a mistress's dominion, a table set not for mercy, but for display of power. The bread broken not with humility, but with smug satisfaction. The mistress sat at the head, her posture stiff and proud, her dress pressed so tightly against her frame that the seams seemed to groan, her smile not gentle but sharpened like the blade of a knife, each curve of her lips hiding the lash of her will. Each blessing she whispered over the food dripping with venom, as though Scripture itself were her accomplice in cruelty around her. The sons sat, their mouths already wet with wine, though their prayers were still half-spoken, their eyes darting from mother to meat, careless, hungry, arrogant, their laughter breaking through the sanctity of him like glass, shattering in a church. For they were raised not in reverence but in indulgence, the blood of others feeding their comfort. The slaves stood along the wall, shadows against shadows, their eyes lowered though they saw everything, the tremor of a hand, the scrape of a chair, the subtle way the mistress's fingers lingered on the silver cross that hung at her throat, polished so clean it reflected firelight like a warning, though to her it was only a charm of false piety. The bread was passed torn with deliberate cruelty, as though each piece were a reminder of who broke and who was broken. The wine poured too heavy, crimson spilling over the lip of the cup and staining the tablecloth, and still the mistress smiled, murmuring psalms under her breath like spells that bound the house together in a cage of sanctified cruelty. And yet beneath the sound of clinking silverware and whispered prayer, something else stirred, something neither hymn nor scripture could silence. The steady breath of the woman with the silent eyes, her stillness heavier than iron, her presence like a storm crouched in the rafters, her silence ringing louder than bells, for every candle flicker seemed to bend toward her, every draught in the room seemed to breathe at her command, and though she did not move, though she did not speak, the room itself seemed to listen, the very walls tilting closer to her heartbeat, as though time itself had chosen her as the center of its spiral. One of the younger sons laughed too loudly, spraying crumbs across the cloth, and the mistress rebuked him with scripture, her voice sharp but sweet, a psalm laced with venom, and still the silent woman did not raise her eyes. But in her lap, her fingers tightened, curling and uncurling like roots in black soil, her silence sharpening to the point of a blade. It was already too late to pray, though the mistress did not know it, for prayer cannot reach when the walls of heaven are sealed by blood, and tonight the walls trembled with the weight of something that had been waiting too long, something older than psalm, something hungrier than hymn, something that had taken the shape of a woman who spoke with silence, and in the kitchen, unseen beyond the laughter and wine, the granary axe leaned against the doorframe, its head catching the faintest gleam of candlelight, its shadow long upon the floor, waiting for the hand that would claim it, waiting for the feast that no hymn could sanctify. The bread was chewed, the wine drained. The mistress smiled, but the table shook with every heartbeat, for the reckoning had already been set, and no prayer would reach the ears that mattered, and as the last hymn broke across the lips of the mistress, the woman with the silent eyes finally lifted her gaze, and the flame of a candle bent sideways, as though bowing in fear. It began not with a scream, not with the rending of voices, but with something far more final, the sound of bone breaking beneath iron, a sound that silences prayer and stills the throat before any word can form, a sound that lives forever once heard. Etched into marrow and memory, the candlelight trembled as though it too recoiled, its flames shrinking back into themselves, and in that moment the house, so long a place of psalms and whips, hymns and cruelty, ceased to be a home and became a tomb. Its walls no longer shelter, but confining stone. Its air heavy with the first breath of death, the mistress's hand, reaching for her chalice, froze mid-air, the smile upon her lips faltering as the sound of that first strike shivered through her bones, her psalm choked into silence, her eyes darting, searching, not yet believing that judgment could enter her house clothed in silence and wielding iron. The woman with the silent eyes stood framed in shadow, the axe gripped not with frenzy but with certainty, each breath steady, her gaze unbroken, her silence heavier than the tolling of any bell, and the axe dripped with the weight of its first strike. Not yet blood, but the memory of what it had been waiting for, mother. One of the sons stammered, his voice cracking, but the rest of the word never came, for the woman's silence swallowed it, and his throat closed as if the house itself pressed in upon him, suffocating him with dread, choking his laughter back into his lungs. The table, still set with bread and wine, gleamed with a sickly beauty, the silverware catching the trembling light as though mocking the sanctity of the feast, each polished surface now reflecting not smiles but terror. Distorted faces bent in shadow, the wine trembling in goblets as though it too had learned to fear. The mistress tried to rise, her chair scraping against the floorboards, but her legs felt bound, as though the very prayers she had weaponized now shackled her, each psalm she had hurled against the weak now echoing back. No longer words of power but curses turned upon their speaker. The axe fell again, and this time the sound was unmistakable, a wet thud, a groan of timber and the shudder of bone, the air filling with a metallic tang, hot and thick, mingling with the sweetness of wine until the whole house reeked of feast and grave together. "Stop her, stop her!" One son shouted, his voice shrill, but the others only stared, paralyzed, their hands trembling upon the table, fingers clutching bread that now crumbled into dust in their grasp, mouths opening but prayers refusing to rise, as if heaven itself had turned its ear away. The woman's silence deepened, her steps measured, deliberate, each one a toll of the invisible bell that marked the hour of reckoning, and the axe swung with rhythm, not wild, not frenzied, but steady, each blow a sentence, each strike a line written into the flesh of those who had written theirs upon others. The mistress cried out then, not in scripture but in raw terror, her hands clutching her cross as though it might save her, but the cross glinted cold, reflecting only firelight, and in that light her face was stripped of its piety, revealing the hollowness beneath, a soul shrieking but unheard. The slaves along the wall did not move, their eyes wide but unflinching, for they knew the weight of silence. They had carried it all their lives, and now that silence had been given form, given voice, given blade, they did not move to stop it, they only bore witness. As one bears witness to storm or fire, and still the axe fell, steady, relentless, its iron head singing through the air, each strike unraveling the fabric of the house, shaking the rafters, splintering the hymn-stained walls, until the very foundations seemed to groan under the burden of its own sins. The bread lay scattered, the wine spilled across the tablecloth, red soaking white, the chalice overturned and rolling across the floor, ringing like a funeral bell, a sound that marked the end of feast and the beginning of death's supper. And when at last the mistress's cry broke the night, it was not the scream of a woman, but the shriek of a beast cornered, hollow and furious, echoing through the plantation fields, carrying across the night air like a curse, and the bells of Easter morning, still tolling faintly in the distance, seemed to mock her, their hollow tones swallowed by the axe's rhythm. The first blow had fallen, and the house would not rise from it, for what begins in silence ends in silence, and now the silence was filled with blood, and in the corner of the room, the youngest son stared at the woman with the silent eyes, his face white with terror, his lips trembling as though forming words he dared not speak, and she turned her gaze upon him, steady, unblinking, fire burning where no fire should live. The axe rose again, its shadow vast upon the wall, and the candle nearest the table guttered out, plunging half the room into darkness, leaving only the sound of breath, of heartbeat, and of the next blow waiting in the air. The night held its breath, yet the house groaned like a dying beast, the air quivering with the rhythm of the axe still wet from its last strike, and in that hollow silence came the patter of small feet, light, frantic, searching for escape that did not exist. They say the little ones ran, their pale hands clutching each other, their faces wet with tears, their mouths open in screams that no one recalls hearing, for the sound was devoured by the greater silence that ruled the house, the silence carried by the woman with the fire. In her eyes, the corridors stretched before them like the throat of a cavern, shadows racing ahead of their small frames, the walls closing tighter, the doors swelling shut, the windows glowing red as though fire pressed against the panes, though no flame had yet touched them. One of the children cried out, "Mother! Mother!" But the name withered in the air, crumbling before it reached the stairwell, as though the house itself had bitten down upon the word and swallowed it whole. No one remembers the doors opening, no hinge creaking, no wood shifting, no bolt sliding free, for escape is a lie in houses where sin has rooted too deep. And so it is said the children did not leave, though their running was seen, though their sobs were felt like nails dragged along the soul. The firelight in the dining hall swelled and flickered, casting long, grotesque shapes across the walls, shadows taller than the children themselves, stretched and distorted until they seemed not of flesh, but of some other substance, clinging to plaster, bending in anguish. The slaves at the edge of the room saw them, their eyes wide, and one whispered, "The shadows run though the children stand still," and none dared to answer him, for to name such a sight is to invite it nearer. The youngest boy pressed against the wall, his fists hammering the boards, his face turning to pale chalk beneath the wash of flame, and yet his shadow twisted, clawed, bent backward upon itself, as if some other hand pulled it from within. Another child, the eldest girl, clutched the crucifix at her neck, whispering broken prayers through sobs. "Deliver us, deliver us, deliver us." But her shadow mouthed no words, its jaw slack and grinning wide, wider than her face could stretch, teeth bared where there were none. The fire crackled in the hearth, though none had stoked it, the embers leaping high, eager, painting the walls in searing strokes, until the room itself seemed to breathe with a furnace's hunger, and in that glow the children's shadows froze, mid-flight, hands reaching upward, caught forever in the moment of their terror. The axe struck again somewhere in the house, and its echo trembled through the boards, shaking the shadows upon the wall, making them dance grotesque, though the children by then had fallen to their knees, their sobs broken into silence, as if their very breath had been stolen away. "They are marked," whispered one of the old women, her voice no louder than the hiss of the fire. "Their blood is written already, their shadows know what comes," and the others shushed her, pressing fingers to lips, for even truth is dangerous when spoken. Aloud before such sights, the mistress's portrait hung crooked above the mantel, her painted eyes glaring down upon the scene, and though her body lay broken on the floor, her likeness seemed to smirk in the dancing light, the painted hand raised as if in benediction over the frozen shadows of her children. The woman with the silent eyes stepped into the hall then, her figure dark, her face unreadable, the axe still dripping, her gaze falling not upon the children themselves but upon the shadows that lingered, watching them as one reads signs in smoke or entrails, her lips unmoving, her silence thicker than prayer. The children pressed back, too afraid to scream now, their small hands trembling as they clutched each other, but their shadows did not cling. They stretched apart, clawing at the floorboards, their fingers long and sharp, dragging down into cracks as though begging the earth to swallow them whole. And then, as the bells of Easter tolled again, faint and hollow across the distant fields, the fire surged high, bursting sparks into the air, and the children's shadows burned black against the wall, seared there as though painted by flame, frozen in gestures of terror, their mouths wide, their arms outstretched, eternal witnesses of their own fear. The children whimpered, alive, trembling, clutching one another, but their shadows no longer moved, no longer mirrored them, nailed to the plaster, black stains in the shape of their dread. Their eyes round, their mouths eternal screams, and as the axe was lifted once more, its edge glinting in the red light, the children turned toward the woman with the silent eyes. But their shadows remained fixed, still reaching, still pleading, still burning, forever trapped on the wall. It began as a table for celebration, a feast to mock the laboring hands that had set it, yet before the night was through, it became something else entirely, an altar upon which the house itself seemed to kneel, its boards creaking like old pews groaning under the weight of sin. The mistress's feast table became an altar, soaked and defiled, a parody of communion, and those who had once feared to look her in the eyes now watched in silence as judgment wrote itself into the wood, with strokes of red too deep to be washed away. The candles guttered in their holders, flames bending low as though ashamed, their wax dripping like tears down brass stems, each drop hissing as it touched the cloth. But the stains beneath had already swallowed everything, thickening into a crimson map that spread wider with every heartbeat. The bread lay torn across the table, no longer food but flesh in waiting, the crust soaked and heavy, the crumbs darkened as though the table itself had eaten, the wine spilled in rivulets that traced crosses upon the boards, each one crooked, each one mocking the prayer it was meant to resemble. Some whispered that when the blood first touched the cloth, it did not soak but clung as though the fabric thirsted, curling and grasping at the red as ivy clings to stone, and when the mistress's body was dragged aside, her blood did not follow her, it remained imprinted, unwilling to leave the altar it had consecrated. The children's frozen shadows still trembled upon the wall, watching the table with hollowed eyes, their hands stretched in supplication, though no plea could rise from their painted mouths, and their silence seemed to feed the cloth further, darkening it until the white linen gleamed no more. "She broke bread with blood," whispered one of the field hands, her voice little more than breath, "and the house will not forget it." But another shushed her harshly, pressing trembling fingers to her lips, for to speak of such things is to invite them deeper into the marrow of the living. The woman with the silent eyes stood before the table, her axe heavy in her hands, her face unreadable, but her gaze fixed upon the cloth as though it had taken life, as though it breathed in rhythm with the flickering of the flames, pulsing faintly dark and wet, whispering through threads not woven by human hand. The air grew heavy, cloying, every breath filled with the stench of iron and ash, and the wine goblets rattled where they had fallen, chiming faintly, like bells muffled under soil, ringing for the dead who had not yet been buried. One of the sons still living crawled toward the table, his hands leaving streaks along the boards, his voice cracking in desperate whimpers, "Mother, mother!" But the body upon the floor gave no reply, and the cloth seemed to shiver as he reached it, his fingers brushing the soaked linen, and for a moment it clung to him. Pulling like wet flesh, he shrieked, recoiling, stumbling back, his hands slick and shining red, though he had not touched a wound, and the cloth settled again. Smooth as skin stretched over bone, silent, waiting, watching. The woman raised her axe then, not toward the sun but toward the table, and the room hushed, as if the very beams leaned close to hear what would follow, and when she struck, the blade buried itself deep into the altar's wood, splitting bread and bone alike. The cloth writhing as though pierced with it, a hiss rose, faint but clear, curling like incense smoke, though no censer had been lit, and the goblets overturned in unison, their final drops spilling into the widening stains, red joining red until the cloth was drowned entirely, its white erased, its purpose reborn in mockery. The house itself seemed to tremble then, the rafters groaning, as though the crossbeams bore too much weight, the hearth flaring in sudden violence, sparks leaping upward, and in that light, the shadows of the children widened. Their screams silent, but their mouths stretched further, as though the altar itself fed upon their fear. Those who stood in the doorway swore they heard a voice rise from the cloth, low and murmuring, not one voice but many, weaving together into a psalm twisted beyond recognition, words once holy now hollow, their cadence broken but still demanding to be heard. A communion of blood in place of bread and the axe, still buried in the altar, pulsed as though with heartbeat, its handle trembling faintly, slick with a wetness that was not wine alone. The woman with the silent eyes did not move, only stared, her chest rising slowly, her silence louder than the whispers gathering in the cloth, her gaze steady upon the stains that refused to fade, and as the last candle guttered out, leaving only the fire's glow, the table gleamed darker still. No longer linen, but something else, something living, clinging to the wood as flesh clings to the bone beneath it. The mistress's feast had become her grave, her altar, her curse, and no hand dared to wash it clean. In the corner of the room, the surviving son whimpered, his back pressed to the wall, and the blood-stained cloth rippled once more, faint as a sigh, as though inviting him nearer. Dawn came not with light, but with a pallor. A pale film stretched across the sky like a shroud drawn over the face of the dead. The fields, usually alive with the restless murmur of wings and the ceaseless rasp of insects, lay in a silence so profound that even breath felt sacrilegious. Not a crow dared caw from the tree line, not a locust stirred the air. The soil itself seemed clenched, as though lips pressed tightly shut against confession. The rows of cotton stood unmoving, their stalks stiff as grave markers, their white tufts grey in the lifeless dawn. Beneath them the dirt had darkened, moist not with dew, but with something thicker, something iron-scented, that seeped upward rather than down. Those who staggered from the house, eyes raw and hands still trembling, felt it first beneath their bare feet. The earth did not yield its usual softness, but felt dense, swollen, as though it had swallowed something it could not digest. One woman, voice trembling, whispered into the silence, "Even the ground's ashamed." Her words fell heavy and the silence deepened, as if the fields had heard and resented the intrusion. The overseer's cabin at the far edge of the land sagged in the dim light, its windows black hollows. The smokehouse stood without its usual scent of meat, its chimneys exhaling nothing. Even the dogs chained nearby had ceased their growling. Their chains lay slack and their bodies hunched low, ears pressed back, as if listening for something the human ear could not catch. The slaves who had lived their lives bent among the rows knew at once. This was not mere quiet. This was refusal. The land had turned inward, refusing to remember, refusing to testify. Yet its very silence was an accusation, and then faintly a sound carried on the still air. Not birdsong, not the hum of cicadas, but the creak of wood. A lone crossbeam swaying at the edge of the field where no wind stirred. The woman with the silent eyes walked toward it, her steps deliberate, the axe still slick in her hand. No one stopped her. They parted as she passed, though not a word was exchanged. For all knew the hush was fragile, that any noise might crack the thin glass dome pressed over the morning. She paused at the edge of the field and knelt. The soil there was darker, almost black, as if stained past recall. Her fingers brushed the surface, and when she lifted them, her skin bore no dirt, only red, fresh, as though the field itself still bled. Behind her a young boy whispered, unable to contain it, "It don't want us here no more." But the older ones hushed him fiercely, casting glances to the cotton rows. For though the plant swayed not at all, there was the sense of listening, of watching, of judgment gathering in roots and stalks. The sky began to bruise with the color of a storm, though no clouds moved. The light dimmed further, shadows growing longer though the sun had barely risen. The air pressed down heavy, metallic in the lungs, as though each breath drew in iron filings. The woman stood, silent as ever, her eyes fixed on the far horizon. There in the distance, where the rows of cotton ended and the tree line began, shadows wavered, not trees, not men, but shapes shifting in the mist. Their edges blurred, yet they seemed countless, bent-backed, moving as though still tethered to invisible rows. None dared call them ghosts aloud. Yet the silence of the field seemed to confirm it. The land bore witness not only to the night just past, but to every lash, every cry, every drop of blood it had swallowed over decades. And now in its muteness it exhaled them. A murmur rose, though not from lips. The stalks trembled faintly, then stilled again. The soil seemed to breathe beneath bare feet. A faint expansion, a faint contraction, like the slow heave of something buried alive. One man dared to speak. Voice ragged, "It'll not forgive." And at that a crow at last cried overhead, a broken, strangled caw, and then fell from the sky stone dead, striking the soil with a thud that echoed louder than it should have. The slaves recoiled. But the woman with the silent eyes did not move. She only looked down at the crow, its feathers splayed, its beak still open as though mid-cry, and then lifted her gaze once more to the endless rows. The fields stretched outward like a graveyard without markers, each cotton stalk a pale candle burning in refusal. The silence grew unbearable, and in that silence, it was as though the earth whispered without sound, promising that what had begun in the house would not remain within its walls. The land itself had become a witness, and as the sun tried to rise higher, its light faltered, paling as though strangled. The fields remained mute, the soil tight-lipped. Only the axe in the woman's hand gleamed, a shard of light in the growing dimness. And in its reflection, for those who dared look closely, shadows of the bent-backed shapes in the distance seemed to march closer, row by row. It was not the church that carried the story, nor the preachers, nor the hymns that once rang proud through Georgia's Sunday air. It was the soil, the wind, and the silence. They carried it like a wound that refused to heal, for some stains cannot be scrubbed away, and some sounds once heard will toll forever. They say the bells still toll each Easter, though no steeple stands to give them voice. No rope to pull, no hand to guide the clapper. The sound rises on its own, deep and hollow, like iron mourning the weight of what it once struck. Farmhands who came after swore they heard it, not at noon, not at midnight, but always just as dawn cracked, and always, without fail, it came from the direction of the house that was no house anymore, the ruin where the mistress's blood once ran across the Easter cloth. The fields refused to forget. The soil, once forced to yield cotton under lash and command, seemed to tighten its jaw against seed and plough alike. Men who tried to farm there spoke of furrows that closed themselves, of stalks that withered though rain had been kind, and always, when the first Easter after the killings came, nothing sprouted at all. The ground turned black, as if charred from within. Old men whispered that the curse was not in the land alone, but in the air. If you walked too far, past the broken granary where the axe had first leaned, you would hear a woman's breath behind you, slow, steady, waiting. Those who turned to look swore they saw no face, only the shine of eyes catching what little moonlight dared fall. And if they stayed too long, the bells would sound again, not from afar this time, but so close it rattled their bones as though struck from within. One traveller, a minister passing through from Savannah, dared to camp near the ruin. He was a man of God, or so he claimed. Armed with scripture and holy tongue, he told the people of the next village that he would cleanse the ground, that no woman's vengeance could linger when the Lord's word was spoken over it. They say he began to read by lantern light, voice raised firm, but before his final verse, the lantern glass cracked as though from a blow. The flames snuffed out, and when villagers found him the next morning, his Bible was gone. Only the Easter cloth remained, folded neatly upon his chest, and across its red-stained weave, fresh words were scrawled in something darker than ink. You cannot wash what was baptized in blood. Some swore it was the woman herself who wrote it, her hand still steady though her body long buried. Others swore it was the mistress, clawing from the grave to curse all who dared forgive her fate. But most would not speak at all, not aloud, for to speak of it was to invite the sound of those bells, and no man, no woman, no child wanted that. The curse spread beyond the land, they said. Children born in the village nearby cried each Easter dawn as though struck. Cows refused to calve in spring, hens refused to lay, and always, in the hush that fell before sunrise, families swore they heard the axe fall again. 1, 2, 3, 4 hour, and then silence, only for the bells to begin tolling, slow, deliberate, endless. A woman old as bone once whispered to a gathering of kin, "It is not she who haunts this place, nor the mistress, nor even the children. It is the act itself, the blow that fell, the blood that spread, the silence that followed. It was too much for time to carry, too heavy for earth to bury, so it tolls, it tolls, it tolls. And it will toll until Easter itself ends, but Easter has not ended, and neither has the tolling to this day. Those who trespass too close to the Georgia fields swear they hear it. The bells, the breath, the axe, and in the half-light, shadows of children still flicker against walls long collapsed. Their small hands raised not in prayer but in terror. No one dares wash the cloth. No one dares move the axe where it rests in rust and ruin. And each year, as Easter nears, people warn their young, do not go near the fields at sunrise, for if the bells toll while you stand upon that soil, you will not return as yourself. And if one listens too closely, so they whisper, the axe does not sound as wood striking flesh anymore. It sounds like the world itself being split open, and something long buried straining to crawl free.